everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. This is Nicole from The Living Well, and I have a special guest. I'm really excited for you ladies to meet. His name is Thomas. And Thomas, can you tell us your title and exactly what type of coach you are? Because I am terrible at that.
Of course. So I trained in something called the Somatic method, which is a way of trying to use the body, which is what somatic is, bodily sensations, and basically understanding how to, figure out our boundaries, our needs, etc., through listening to the body, which is one of the three systems that we have. We have cognition, which is thought, we have emotion, and we have somatic signals. All of these is an organism telling us, whether something is a threat to us, whether something is what we should seek out, what we should avoid. And only by integrating and listening to all three systems can we make wise and good decisions.
Awesome. So when we come out of a narcissistically abusive relationship, we usually suffer with several physical issues like anxiety, depression, sleep issues, PTSD symptoms. Some people say they're more like PTSD-esque type of behavior, but I think it's the legitimate PTSD. And so that's so important that we learn how to listen to our bodies again and come out of trauma and regulate the nervous system so that we can think clearly, because we both know, and I tell this to my clients and the women in our community all the time, that when we're in fight or flight, the part of our brain that's responsible for deep cognitive thinking is hindered, right? And so then these women and even ourselves, we're not thinking clearly, and we're trying to navigate this very difficult terrain without our thinking capabilities on board, kind of like trying to do it while you're drunk. It's really hard to do, and it's complicated. So we are going to talk all about, me and Thomas are collaborating, and we're going to talk all about the nervous system and the scientific component that is responsible for regulating it. And they call this somatic experience, I believe, but that's not my forte. That's why we have Thomas on board. And so I'm really super excited to have you. Thank you. This is a huge missing piece in our industry, is how to physically cope with the physical ramifications of long-term abuse. And so we're really excited to explore that with you, Thomas. Thank you. So today we were going to talk about empathy. And the reason why this is so important is because narcissists is either hindered or fully they're incapable of having true empathy for their targets, which makes them very dangerous. And so we're going to talk about empathy. What is it? And how does this affect the narcissist's thinking? And how do we combat an individual that doesn't have any empathy for us as people, right? This is a big problem. So the definition, according to Webster's dictionary, of empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of one another. So if you don't feel something for somebody else, then you're capable of doing almost anything, and you don't have that regulation. And Thomas is going to get into the scientific explanation of this, but from a survivor's perspective, I know currently that if I don't do certain things to certain people because that would make me feel terrible. You don't cheat on your husband because you think that would totally hurt him. I can't do that to him. Or, run over a dog because you feel compassion for an animal. Or you don't, abuse your children because you don't want to damage them and you don't want to hurt them. But a narcissist doesn't have that ability to feel on the behalf of somebody else. So therefore, they're capable of doing anything to anybody because there's nothing stopping them. That's what I understand from a survivor's perspective. But Thomas is going to go even deeper into this. You guys are going to love it.
So I think empathy is very fascinating and very interesting. And I think first, let's just look at what empathy is, because you obviously read up that definition, but I think we can go into a lot more details that make us understand it more. So first, empathy consists of something that develops in the brain called mirror neurons. And it basically means that when I see you, something happening to you, these networks fire up in my brain and makes me, like you said, feel that the same to some extent is happening to me, which is why I might act. with compassion and try and help you, etc. I might feel bad when I see you in distress because that makes these mirror neurons fire in my brain. But there's different elements to what empathy actually is. So there's which I think we need to define, because I don't think that definition online is that great. There's cognitive empathy, which is basically mean the ability to logically understand the experience of the other person. So that means I can put myself in your shoes of your experience logically and try and understand that, right? So that's cognitive. Then there's emotional empathy, which is me emotionally being able to feel what you're feeling. But it's possible to feel without being able to cognitively understand what's happening. And then there's the last part, which is probably the most important element of empathy, is compassionate empathy. That means the ability to act on empathy by being compassionate and helping another human being. And what's interesting to understand is that we are only able to act on empathy when we are within what's called our window of tolerance, meaning when we feel regulated. If suddenly we become too dysregulated, we go into a fight, a flight, a freeze, a pawn response, and we are no longer able to necessarily act empathetic. And therefore, it also requires a skill of regulation, that you can actually regulate yourself to be able to act empathetically. But go into a state of shock is not going to take any action to help, not because they're a bad person, not because they feel nothing, but because their nervous system is overwhelmed, right?
Mm.
And one of the dangers we have with a narcissist is that often the narcissists target very empathetic people, and we tend to interpret the world, or we interpret the world and other people's actions from our own perspective, meaning we try to make sense of the narcissist's behavior from our own frame of reference. And actually, the narcissists prey on this because empathetic people have a tendency to want to understand the why. Why does somebody do something? A narcissist doesn't have that need. They simply don't care. All they care about whether they get their desired outcome or not. They don't care about the why behind people's actions. Empathetic people care about the why. And this is part of what also gets us trapped in, because they keep us stuck in a confusion where we want the answer why. And because of that, we keep also coming back. And this is why it's so difficult for us to suddenly be discarded, because we're left without a completion and ending that leave us pondering why. What happened? Was it me? Was it X, Y, and Z? So we are stuck in this loop that we can't really get ended, which causes obviously a lot of pain and frustration, etc. But yes, you had a few specific questions, I think, about narcissism. Do you want to throw them, and I'll try and answer those?
Yeah, so what I found in my research is that the narcissist is dangerous because of their lack of empathy on a spectrum, right? So, because the sociopath has zero empathy or ability to, but now that you've added 3 different layers of components, it actually complicates it. But how do you feel about that whole component? Do you think a narcissist is either more narcissistic or less narcissistic based on their lack of empathy, is the theory states?
So I think, again, we can't put it that simple, because there's obviously many different traits of narcissism, and like you're right, they're operating on different spectrums.
Yeah.
I think that you can definitely say that the less empathy they have, the more dangerous they become. That's true. And the higher out on the spectrum they are, as you said, the further they go towards sociopsychopath. And it's very interesting, because I guess also just to look at this from a perspective of people going out and dating, we tend to have this idea. I hear a lot of people say, and a lot of women saying, oh, I want the most confident guy in the room. And what I often say to them is, we have this perception that the dangerous person is a quiet person sitting in the corner. That's often not the case, as we know. The narcissist is very charming, but also the narcissist lack empathy. And also part of this is wired into the fact, especially for the social psychopath, or if they're on the high spectrum of narcissism, is that they lack the connection that we normally have with something called our amygdala, which is the fear response. And that means, again, when something happens to you, I feel a sense of discomfort. It makes me feel really uncomfortable in my body. And that's linked to this link we have in the brain. They don't have a strong link, and to some extent they're missing this wiring, meaning that they don't feel fear, especially the social psychopath, which is why in a social setting they will appear as the most confident person in the room, because they feel no anxiety going up to anyone, which is why they can appear to be so charming, which is why that's often the person where you need to step back and maybe view a bit more and say, is this a safe person or not? So I think you're absolutely right. With narcissism, there's certainly a huge lack of empathy, which obviously makes them capable of prioritizing their own needs. So I think one thing that we have to remember is that in healthy relationships, there's a core term that is absolutely essential that distinguish the difference between an adult and a child relationship and an adult relationship. And that is, in an adult child relationship, which is essentially what you form with a narcissist to some extent, is that there's a dependency and there's a lack of mutuality, meaning your child does not care about your needs. You just have to take care of them. Your child doesn't really care about calling you an asshole or say, oh, daddy, I never want to see you again, when they're dysregulated. And you kind of just accept that because they're a child. There's a lack of mutuality for each other's boundaries and also with each other's needs. With an adult relationship is defined by the fact you're supposed to have mutuality, meaning you're supposed to both care about each other's needs and each other's boundaries. And if you don't, you're not having an adult relationship, you're having an adult-child relationship. And essentially what we form with a narcissist is an adult-child dynamic, because you're dealing with somebody who's unable to regulate, who only care about themselves, and who lack the ability and the brain development to have a full-scaled adult sense of empathy.
That's so good. That was my second question for you, because I've been reading this book called, it's a really good book. I don't know if you've seen this one. It's called What Happened to You by Oprah Winfrey and Bruce Perry. And it talks about childhood trauma. And one of the main takeaways that I've got from it so far, I'm about a fourth way through, is that the human brain is, when you're a baby, based on how you were loved and treated, actually hinders, or so basically your brain grows based on your experience. So the more compassion and empathy you were shown, the more your brain grows that ability. Is that your understanding of how the brain works? As far as empathy, is it empathy learned, and that part of the brain grows and develops based on your exposure?
So it's a really good question, and I think it's probably a bit more complex in a way. There's always a mixture between genetics and exposure and social conditioning, of course. And I think what's very interesting that we are starting to understand is what's called epigenetics. And what that means is that our experiences impact what genes are expressed. And what that means, I believe it's about 2% of the population are born with the genetic tendency to become a psychopath, but not everybody develops into a full-fledged psychopath. Because if they grew up in a really nurturing environment, it might not have triggered those genes fully, right?
Wow.
Same with somebody who can be disposed for cancer, but never get cancer if nothing ever triggered those genes. But you have somebody who can smoke their whole life and don't get cancer because they didn't have the genes for it, right? So it's a mixture between the two that impact each other. So of course, adverse childhood experiences, which is same to childhood trauma, it's just a different term for it, obviously have an impact on what genetics are expressed and how they're expressed and how the brain is formed. Yes. And I think it's important to understand that, trying to interpret the narcissist actions through your framework of reference can actually become quite dangerous, because then you start making excuses for this person because you believe that their brain functions the same way your brain does, and it doesn't. And the idea that they're going to change and become a better person, or that it's going to go back to the idealization stage, is based on this bias in your brain that makes you believe that others are similar to you, when the narcissists fundamentally are not, and they will not change. If anything, they have shown, both sociopsychopath and narcissists have shown to become worse in therapy, not better. So, they're not going to get better. They're not going to change. And I think that's important to understand, that there actually is a difference in their brain structure and how they perceive the world. And they target you for very specific traits that you have that, unless you go in and start healing and working with that, then you're likely to be re-exposed to this. And also, once you've been exposed to one narcissist, you're more likely to be re-exposed again, because it's, again, when you have been addicted to drugs, you're more likely to suddenly get engaged with drugs again at a later stage, and you have to have even more abstinence and stay away, right? So this is the same. You're more likely, because now your brain has been primed for this high stimulation, which is what they give you in the idealization stage with love bombing. They mirror you, they future pace and talk about the future. So you again emotionally invest in that, right? All this they go quick to physicality, give you this boost in dopamine. They give you all this validation that you probably crave for your whole life. and sense of connection. So dopamine, oxytocin is flooding your brain like never before, which is what formed this trauma bond that we talked about before this call. And also the actual addiction, which makes it so hard to break. And once you had that, and a lot of people will report that and say, oh, it's hard to go back to dating because normal people are so boring. It's because your brain has now been primed to seek this high stimulation, which means you're more likely to gravitate towards that unless you understand and can break these patterns.
And that's exactly what we're teaching at the Living Well. But if you want to work directly with Thomas, he does take clients one-on-one. His information is available at the description of this video, and you can find us at thelivingwellcoaching.com. Isn't this amazing and fascinating? And there's going to be so much more. I'm so excited to be working with you, Thomas. Thank you so much. I appreciate you.
My pleasure.